Black history is not a footnote. It is not a sidebar. It is not a seasonal remembrance confined to a single month on the calendar. Black history is a living odyssey, one that stretches across centuries, continents, and oceans. It is a story written not only in ink and law, but in memory, music, movement, and survival. To understand the modern world, one must first understand this journey. The story begins long before ships crossed the Atlantic. Before chains. Before plantations. It begins in Africa, a vast and diverse continent of kingdoms, universities, trade routes, and spiritual systems. Civilizations such as Mali, Songhai, Benin, and Congo thrived with complex governance, architecture, metallurgy, astronomy, and education. Timbuktu stood as a global center of learning, its libraries holding tens of thousands of manuscripts while much of Europe was still emerging from the Middle Ages. This was not a people without history. This was a people with too much history to be erased easily. But beginning in the 15th century, European expansion, fueled by greed and empire, collided with Africa in catastrophic ways. What followed was one of the largest forced migrations in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Over the course of roughly 400 years, from the 1500s to the 1800s, an estimated 12.5 million African men, women, and children were kidnapped, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. Approximately 10.7 million survived the journey. Millions did not. The Middle Passage was not a route, it was a graveyard. Bodies were stacked below decks in spaces barely tall enough to sit upright. Disease spread rapidly. Food was scarce. Resistance was punished with brutality. Some captives chose the ocean over bondage, leaping into the water in final acts of defiance. Sharks followed the ships. Yet even here, in the darkest corridor of human history, survival itself became resistance. Those who lived carried more than trauma. They carried language fragments, drum rhythms, agricultural knowledge, spiritual beliefs, and communal traditions. These cultural seeds took root in the Americas, forming what we now call the African diaspora, a global network of black cultures stretching from Brazil to the Caribbean, from the United States to Canada. In North America, slavery hardened into an institution. Laws were written to define human beings as property. Generations were born into bondage, their lives measured in profit and productivity. Families were separated at auction blocks. Names were stripped away. Literacy was criminalized. And yet, culture endured, encoded in spirituals, folktales, foodways, and faith. Enslaved Africans built the economic foundation of the New World. They cleared land, cultivated cotton, rice, sugar, and tobacco, and generated immense wealth that fueled the rise of modern capitalism. The irony was cruel and enduring, a nation built on freedom was sustained by slavery. But history is not only shaped by oppression. It is shaped by resistance. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, enslaved people resisted in countless ways, through work slowdowns, sabotage, escape, rebellion, and preservation of identity. Maroon communities formed in swamps and mountains, creating autonomous black settlements beyond colonial control. Revolts erupted, from the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina to the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved Africans defeated European powers and established the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere. And in the United States, resistance took on a secret, dangerous, and extraordinary form. It was called the Underground Railroad. Despite its name, it was neither underground nor a railroad. It was a covert network of people, black and white, who believed that slavery was a moral abomination. It was a geography of courage, mapped through whispers, symbols, coded songs, and moonlit paths. Safe houses became stations. Guides became conductors. Freedom was the destination. Among the most legendary of these conductors was Harriet Tubman. Born into slavery in Maryland, Tubman escaped in 1849. But freedom alone was not enough. Over the next decade, she returned to the South roughly 13 times, guiding approximately 70 enslaved people to freedom, including members of her own family. She moved by night, followed the North Star, and trusted her faith. She was armed. She was relentless. She never lost a passenger. For many freedom seekers, the journey did not end in the northern United States. Even after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which allowed enslavers to reclaim escaped people in free states, safety was not guaranteed. True freedom lay farther north, in Canada. By the 1830s, Upper Canada had become a refuge. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 had already outlawed slavery across the British Empire. Black communities formed in Ontario and Nova Scotia, places like Buxton and Africville, where formerly enslaved people built schools, churches, and businesses. This migration was not just escape. It was declaration. It said, "We will decide our own humanity." By the time the American Civil War erupted in 1861, black people were already shaping the moral direction of the nation. When President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate states, but freedom was fragile. It was incomplete. And it would be fiercely contested. The end of slavery did not end the struggle. It transformed it. And as the 19th century closed, a new chapter began, one marked not by chains, but by laws designed to maintain the same hierarchy under different names. Reconstruction, betrayal, and the rise of Jim Crow. The war ended. The chains were broken. But freedom, true freedom, remained unfinished. In 1865, the Civil War closed the bloodiest chapter in American history. The Union had prevailed. The Confederacy had fallen. And with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, slavery was formally abolished in the United States. For nearly 4 million formerly enslaved black Americans, emancipation was both a miracle and a question mark. What did freedom mean in a land that had never imagined black equality? For a brief moment, just a moment, possibility flickered. This period became known as Reconstruction, an ambitious and fragile attempt to rebuild a nation torn apart by slavery. Between 1865 and 1877, the federal government introduced sweeping reforms designed to redefine citizenship itself. The 14th Amendment granted black Americans birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment declared that the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of race. For the first time in American history, black men voted. They held office. They shaped laws. More than 2,000 black Americans served in public office during Reconstruction. Some were local officials. Others were state legislators. And a few, once enslaved, took seats in the United States Congress. Schools were built. Churches became political centers. Black families reunited, legally marrying for the first time after generations of forced separation. It was a radical vision, a multiracial democracy rising from the ashes of slavery. And it terrified those who had once ruled unchallenged. White supremacist violence surged almost immediately. Paramilitary groups formed with the sole purpose of destroying Reconstruction from within. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865, used terror as a political weapon, lynchings, arson, beatings, and mass intimidation campaigns designed to suppress black political participation. Freedom had been declared. But it was not defended. By 1877, political compromise sealed Reconstruction's fate. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Protection vanished overnight. What followed was not reconciliation, it was retaliation. Southern states moved swiftly to reclaim control through law. They called them Black Codes. These laws criminalized everyday life for black Americans: vagrancy, unemployment, even standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Arrests led to fines. Fines led to forced labor. Through convict leasing, black men were sold to private companies to work in mines, fields, and railroads under conditions often worse than slavery itself. Slavery had not disappeared. It had evolved. By the late 19th century, the system hardened into something even more insidious: Jim Crow. Segregation was no longer informal, it was codified. Separate schools. Separate transportation. Separate hospitals. Separate cemeteries. The Supreme Court sanctioned this racial apartheid in 1896, with its ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring that separate but equal was constitutional. It was a lie, one enforced by law and violence. Black schools were underfunded. Black neighborhoods were redlined. Black labor was exploited. And above all, black bodies were policed through terror. Lynching became a public ritual. Between the 1880s and the mid-20th century, over 4,000 documented lynchings took place in the United States, most of them black men, women, and children. These were not secret crimes. they were community events. Crowds gathered. Photographs were taken. Souvenirs were collected. Justice did not look away. It participated. And yet, even in this era of brutal repression, black resistance did not disappear. It adapted. Black newspapers documented atrocities when white presses remained silent. Black educators built institutions against impossible odds. Historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, became sanctuaries of learning and leadership. Black entrepreneurs created parallel economies when exclusion left no other choice. One voice rose above the silence, a woman who refused to let the nation forget. Ida B. Wells. A journalist, teacher, and activist, Wells risked her life exposing the truth about lynching. She dismantled the myth that these killings were responses to crime, revealing instead that they were tools of racial control. Her printing press was destroyed. Her life was threatened. She did not stop. Memory itself became resistance. At the same time, millions of black Americans made a bold decision to leave. Beginning around 1916, a mass movement reshaped the country, the Great Migration. Over 6 million black Americans fled the South, heading north and west in search of safety, jobs, and dignity. They boarded trains with suitcases, Bibles, and hope, transforming cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Los Angeles. They carried the South with them, its music, its food, its faith. Out of this movement came a cultural renaissance. In Harlem, black creativity exploded. Writers, musicians, artists, and intellectuals redefined American culture itself. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong gave voice to a people long denied one. Jazz, blues, and poetry told stories history books refused to record. This was not escape. It was declaration. Black America was still fighting, still building, still refusing to vanish. But the question remained, unanswered and unresolved. Would the nation ever live up to its promise? The answer would come not quietly, but in the streets, on the buses, in the courts, and on the evening news. The next movement would shake the world. The Civil Rights Movement, Struggle and Transformation. The mid-20th century arrived with a contradiction so glaring it could no longer be ignored. Black soldiers had fought fascism abroad. They had stormed beaches. They had liberated concentration camps. They had returned home decorated and scarred, only to be denied service at lunch counters, barred from voting booths, and beaten for demanding equality. Something had to break. And it did. The civil rights movement did not begin with a single moment. It was not born in a courtroom or on a bus. It emerged from generations of resistance, from the churches, the kitchens, the classrooms, and the streets. It was the culmination of centuries of struggle, distilled into a decade of action that would transform the nation. It began quietly, in places where injustice had grown too loud to ignore. In 1954, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that shook the foundations of segregation. Brown v. Board of Education declared that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal, overturning the legal doctrine that had justified Jim Crow for nearly 6 decades. It was a victory on paper. But paper does not integrate schools. People do. And the resistance was fierce. When 9 black students attempted to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957, they were met with mobs screaming hatred. The governor called in the National Guard, not to protect the students, but to block them. It took federal intervention to enforce the law. The message was clear: equality would not be given. It would have to be taken. And so, it was. On December 1, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a city bus to a white passenger. She was arrested. Her act of defiance was not spontaneous, it was strategic. Parks was a trained activist, deeply connected to the NAACP and the local black community. Her arrest ignited a movement. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. Black residents, who made up the majority of the bus system's riders, walked, carpooled, and organized with extraordinary discipline. They faced economic retaliation. They faced violence. They did not break. Leading the boycott was a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance became the moral foundation of the movement. Drawing from the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi and the Christian gospel, King argued that oppression could be confronted without hatred, that injustice could be resisted without violence, and that love could be a revolutionary force. His words moved millions. But words alone did not change laws. Action did. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, the movement escalated. Sit-ins spread across the South as black college students occupied segregated lunch counters, refusing to leave until they were served. They were spat on. They were beaten. They did not retaliate. Freedom riders boarded buses to challenge segregation in interstate travel. They were firebombed. They were arrested. They continued. In 1963, the movement reached a turning point. Birmingham, Alabama, became a battleground. Known as one of the most segregated cities in America, Birmingham was chosen deliberately. King and other leaders organized mass demonstrations, knowing the city's violent response would force the nation to confront its conscience. They were right. Police Commissioner Bull Connor unleashed dogs and fire hoses on peaceful protesters, including children. The images were broadcast around the world. The brutality was undeniable. Public opinion shifted. That same year, over 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C., for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was the largest demonstration for civil rights in American history. Standing before the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech that would echo through generations. He spoke of a dream. A dream where children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. A dream rooted in the American promise, demanding that the nation finally live up to its creed. It was poetry. It was prophecy. It was pressure. And it worked. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, outlawing segregation in public places and banning employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It was the most comprehensive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. But voting rights remained under assault. In the South, black citizens faced poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright violence when they attempted to register to vote. In Selma, Alabama, activists organized a march to Montgomery to demand federal protection for voting rights. On March 7, 1965, they set out across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They were met with state troopers wielding clubs and tear gas. The attack was so brutal it became known as Bloody Sunday. Once again, the images reached living rooms across America. Once again, the nation could not look away. 2 weeks later, protected by federal troops, thousands marched the full distance from Selma to Montgomery. That same year, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, prohibiting racial discrimination in voting and authorizing federal oversight of elections in areas with histories of disenfranchisement. These were monumental victories. But the movement was not monolithic. And not everyone believed in nonviolence. In the urban North, where segregation was enforced through housing discrimination, economic exclusion, and police brutality rather than Jim Crow laws, frustration boiled over. Riots erupted in cities like Watts, Detroit, and Newark. Buildings burned. The anger was real. And new voices emerged. Malcolm X offered a different vision, one rooted in black pride, self-defense, and skepticism of integration. He challenged the idea that black people should beg for rights that were already theirs. He spoke of liberation, not just inclusion. His message resonated, especially among young people who had grown weary of waiting for white America's approval. The Black Power movement rose in response, emphasizing racial pride, economic independence, and political self-determination. Organizations like the Black Panther Party provided community services, free breakfast programs, health clinics, education, while also asserting the right to armed self-defense. The movement was evolving. And the backlash was intensifying. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He had gone there to support striking sanitation workers. He was 39 years old. His death devastated the nation. Riots erupted in over 100 cities. The dream he had spoken of seemed further away than ever. But the work did not stop. The civil rights movement had fundamentally altered American society. It had dismantled legal segregation. It had secured voting rights. It had inspired liberation movements around the world. And it had proven something essential, that ordinary people, organized and determined, could change history. But the struggle was far from over. New battles were already forming, over education, housing, employment, and criminal justice. The tools of oppression had changed, but the fight for equality continued. And it continues still. Black history in Canada, a parallel struggle. For many, Canada exists in the popular imagination as a final destination, a northern refuge at the end of the Underground Railroad. A place where freedom waited just across the border. But Black history in Canada did not begin with escape. And it did not begin with freedom. It began centuries earlier, rooted in colonial expansion, empire, and contradiction. Enslaved Africans lived and labored in New France and later British North America. They worked as domestic servants, farm laborers, and skilled tradespeople. Their presence was real, their contributions essential, and yet their stories were systematically erased from the national narrative. Slavery existed on Canadian soil. The first documented enslaved African in Canada was a young boy brought to New France in 1628. Over the following centuries, thousands more would follow, bought, sold, and exploited under French and British rule. Slavery in Canada was smaller in scale than in the American South, but it was no less brutal for those who endured it. When it was gradually abolished, equality did not follow. Black loyalists, men and women who fought for the British during the American Revolutionary War, arrived in Canada in the late 1700s with promises of land and opportunity. What many received instead were barren plots, broken commitments, and racial exclusion. Despite this, they built enduring communities in places like Birchtown, Nova Scotia, one of the largest free Black settlements in North America at the time. They built churches. They built schools. They built futures, often without support, and sometimes in open resistance to hostility. In the 19th century, Canada became a critical destination along the Underground Railroad. Thousands of freedom seekers crossed into Upper Canada, driven by the belief that beyond the border, slavery could not follow. Communities formed in Windsor, Chatham, Toronto, and Buxton, where Black families owned land, educated their children, and governed themselves. The Buxton settlement stood as a powerful model of Black self-determination, integrated schools, economic independence, and collective resilience in an era defined by racial exclusion elsewhere. But sanctuary did not mean equality. Black Canadians faced segregated schools, restricted employment, housing discrimination, and social exclusion well into the 20th century. In Ontario, separate schools for Black children existed legally until 1964. In Nova Scotia, Africville, a vibrant Black community, was denied basic services for decades, only to be destroyed under the banner of urban renewal in the 1960s. Progress came, but often at the cost of displacement and silence. Still, Black Canadians shaped the nation. They served in Canada's military during both World Wars, fighting for freedoms abroad that were not always guaranteed at home. Black soldiers faced discrimination within the ranks, were often relegated to labor battalions, and returned home to the same prejudice they had left. Yet they served with distinction. And they demanded recognition. In the realm of culture, Black Canadians left an indelible mark. Oscar Peterson, born in Montreal, became one of the greatest jazz pianists in history, his virtuosity transcending borders and genres. Portia White, a classical soprano from Nova Scotia, broke barriers in a field that rarely welcomed Black performers. Their art was resistance. Their excellence was defiance. And then there was Viola Desmond. In 1946, in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, Desmond took a seat in the whites-only section of a movie theater. When she refused to move, she was forcibly removed, arrested, and convicted. She fought the charge, taking her case through the courts, though she ultimately lost. Her stand predates Rosa Parks by nearly a decade. It was an act of courage that challenged segregation in Canada and exposed the myth that racism was an American problem. Desmond's story was largely forgotten for decades, buried beneath a national narrative that preferred to celebrate Canada as a refuge rather than confront its own history of exclusion. But memory has a way of resurfacing. In 2010, Viola Desmond received a posthumous pardon. In 2018, her image appeared on the Canadian $10 bill, the first Canadian woman to be so honored. Recognition came late. But it came. Throughout the 20th century, Black Canadians continued to fight for equality in education, employment, housing, and justice. They organized. They protested. They built institutions, community centers, advocacy groups, cultural organizations that sustained and empowered Black communities across the country. They were not passive beneficiaries of Canadian tolerance. They were active architects of their own liberation. In the 1960s and 1970s, inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States and decolonization movements in Africa and the Caribbean, Black Canadians mobilized around issues of systemic racism and representation. The Black Power movement found expression in Canada, particularly among Caribbean immigrants and their children, who challenged discrimination in policing, education, and media. Organizations like the National Black Coalition of Canada and the Black United Front emerged to advocate for policy change and community empowerment. The struggle was local, but it was also global. Immigration from the Caribbean, Africa, and other parts of the African diaspora transformed the demographic landscape of Canada in the latter half of the 20th century. These communities brought new energy, perspectives, and demands for justice. They enriched Canadian culture through music, literature, cuisine, and activism, while also confronting the reality that Canada was not immune to racism. And that reality persists. Black Canadians today continue to face disproportionate rates of poverty, incarceration, and police violence. They are underrepresented in positions of power and overrepresented in systems of control. The myth of Canadian multiculturalism often obscures these inequalities, making them harder to address. But the work continues. Activists, educators, artists, and organizers are reclaiming Black Canadian history, demanding accountability, and building a future rooted in justice rather than mythology. These stories challenge the myth of Canadian innocence. Black history in Canada is not borrowed. It is foundational. It is a history of survival, contribution, and persistence, woven into the fabric of the country, whether acknowledged or not. It reminds us that justice is not inherited. It must be built, protected, and renewed. The long arc, from civil rights to Black Lives Matter. The civil rights movement achieved legal victories that reshaped American society. But laws do not change hearts. And systems do not dismantle themselves. By the 1970s, the euphoria of legislative success began to fade as the realities of persistent inequality became undeniable. Segregation had been outlawed, but schools remained divided by neighborhood boundaries drawn along racial lines. Discrimination in employment was illegal, but Black unemployment remained double that of white Americans. Voting rights were protected, but political power remained concentrated in white hands. The dream deferred. In response, the focus shifted from civil rights to economic justice, from integration to empowerment. Leaders like Jesse Jackson launched campaigns for economic equity and political representation. The Congressional Black Caucus formed to advocate for Black communities within the halls of power. But the backlash was already underway. The war on drugs, launched in the 1980s, became a war on Black communities. Crack cocaine, a cheaper form of the drug that devastated urban neighborhoods, was penalized far more harshly than powder cocaine, which was more commonly used by white Americans. Mandatory minimum sentences filled prisons with Black men, tearing apart families and communities. Mass incarceration became the new Jim Crow. By the turn of the 21st century, the United States had the highest incarceration rate in the world. Black Americans, who make up roughly 13% of the population, accounted for nearly 40% of the prison population. The criminal justice system replicated the racial hierarchy that slavery and segregation had established. Prisons became plantations. Policing became patrol. And then, the cameras came. In the age of smartphones and social media, violence that had always existed became undeniable. Video after video emerged, Black men and women killed by police during traffic stops, while selling cigarettes, while sleeping in their homes, while jogging in their neighborhoods. Their names became rallying cries. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. Each name represented a life, a family, a community in mourning. In 2013, after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin, 3 Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, created a hashtag that would become a movement. Black Lives Matter. What began as a social media declaration evolved into a decentralized global network demanding an end to state violence against Black people. The movement rejected traditional hierarchies, centering the voices of black women, LGBTQ+ individuals, and those most marginalized within marginalized communities. It was a new kind of resistance. Protests erupted across the country and the world. In Ferguson, Missouri, after the killing of Michael Brown, demonstrators faced military-grade police equipment. In Baltimore, after the death of Freddie Gray, the city erupted in anger and grief. And in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, the world watched as a police officer knelt on his neck for over 9 minutes. Floyd's final words, "I can't breathe," became a global cry for justice. Protests spread to all 50 states and over 60 countries. Millions marched. Statues of Confederate leaders and colonizers were toppled. Institutions were forced to reckon with their complicity in systemic racism. It was the largest protest movement in American history. And it was met with both solidarity and suppression. Police responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, and mass arrests. Politicians called for order. But the movement did not relent. Because this was not just about individual officers or isolated incidents. It was about a system. A system that devalues black life. A system that criminalizes blackness. A system that profits from black suffering while denying black humanity. Black Lives Matter demanded more than reform. It demanded transformation. Calls to defund the police, to invest in communities rather than carceral systems, to reimagine public safety, these were not radical fantasies. They were rooted in decades of research, organizing, and lived experience. And they were rooted in history. Because the struggle for black liberation has always been about more than equality within an unjust system. It has been about dismantling that system and building something new. This is the long arc. From the abolition of slavery to the fight against mass incarceration. From the demand for voting rights to the demand for political power. From the dream of integration to the vision of liberation. The tools change. The terrain shifts. But the struggle continues. Culture as resistance, the black arts movement and beyond. Throughout history, black people have used culture as a weapon, a sanctuary, and a declaration of humanity. When words were stolen, rhythm remained. When history was erased, stories were passed down. When identity was denied, art became proof of existence. The black arts movement of the 1960s and 1970s was the cultural arm of the Black Power movement. Writers, poets, musicians, and visual artists rejected the idea that black art should appeal to white audiences or conform to white standards. They created work that was unapologetically black, rooted in black experiences, addressed to black communities, and committed to black liberation. Amiri Baraka, Nikki Giovanni, Sonia Sanchez, and others wrote poetry that was raw, political, and revolutionary. Their words were performed in community centers, on street corners, in churches, anywhere people gathered. Art was not separate from struggle. It was struggle. Music, too, became a site of resistance and reinvention. Jazz had long been a black art form, but in the hands of artists like John Coltrane, Nina Simone, and Sun Ra, it became a spiritual and political force. Simone's voice carried both pain and power, her songs addressing racism, violence, and the demand for freedom. Hip-hop emerged in the 1970s in the Bronx, born from the creativity and resilience of black and Latino youth in marginalized communities. DJs, MCs, breakdancers, and graffiti artists created a culture that spoke to their reality, poverty, police brutality, systemic neglect, and transformed it into art. Hip-hop became the voice of a generation. And then many generations. From Grandmaster Flash to Public Enemy, from Tupac to Kendrick Lamar, hip-hop has documented black life, challenged power, and shaped global culture. It has been commodified, criticized, and co-opted, but it has also remained a space where black voices can speak truth. In literature, black writers continue to expand the boundaries of storytelling. Toni Morrison explored the psychological and spiritual scars of slavery. James Baldwin dissected race, sexuality, and America's moral failures. Alice Walker centered black women's experiences in ways that had been ignored. Their work was not just representation. It was reckoning. In film and television, black creators fought for control over their own narratives. Spike Lee, Ava DuVernay, Barry Jenkins, and others told stories that challenged stereotypes, celebrated blackness, and demanded complexity. Representation mattered, not just in front of the camera, but behind it. And in the 21st century, black culture has become global culture. From Beyoncé's visual albums to the global phenomenon of Black Panther, from the dominance of black athletes to the influence of black fashion and language, blackness shapes the world. But influence is not the same as power. And visibility is not the same as liberation. Black culture is often celebrated while black people remain oppressed. Black creativity is commodified while black communities are underfunded. Black excellence is praised while black struggle is ignored. This contradiction is not new. It is the same tension that has always existed between the desire to see black humanity reflected in the world and the demand for systemic change that makes that humanity undeniable. Culture alone cannot free a people. But it can sustain them. It can inspire them. It can remind them of who they are and what they are fighting for. And it can force the world to pay attention. Education, erasure, and the fight for truth. History is not neutral. It is written by those in power, shaped by their interests, and taught to serve their purposes. For centuries, black history was erased, distorted, or reduced to footnotes. Textbooks taught that enslaved people were content, that the Civil War was about states' rights, that segregation ended peacefully, and that racism was a relic of the past. These were lies. And they were taught as truth. The consequences of this erasure are profound. When children do not learn the full history of their country, they cannot understand its present. When black children do not see themselves in history, they are denied their heritage. When white children are taught a sanitized version of the past, they are unprepared to confront ongoing injustice. Education becomes indoctrination. But there has always been resistance. Carter G. Woodson, often called the father of black history, founded Negro History Week in 1926 because he understood that if black people did not tell their own stories, no one else would. That week eventually became Black History Month, a designated time to celebrate and educate. But Woodson's vision was not confinement to a single month. It was integration into the full curriculum. It was recognition that black history is American history, world history, human history. That vision remains unfulfilled. In recent years, the fight over how history is taught has intensified. Critical race theory, an academic framework examining how racism is embedded in legal systems and policies, became a political flashpoint. Efforts to ban books, restrict curricula, and silence discussions of race spread across the country. The goal was clear: to prevent students from learning uncomfortable truths. But discomfort is not harm. Ignorance is. Teachers, librarians, students, and activists have pushed back, demanding honest education. They have fought to include diverse voices, to teach the complexities of history, and to prepare young people to build a more just future. Because the stories we tell shape the world we build. And the stories that have been silenced for too long are finally being heard. Black history today, unfinished and unfolding. Black history did not end. It is not a closed chapter in a textbook. It is happening now, in courtrooms and classrooms, in boardrooms and ballot boxes, in hospitals and housing projects, in art galleries and on city streets. It is happening in the fight for reparations, the demand that the descendants of enslaved people receive compensation for centuries of unpaid labor and systemic theft. It is happening in the movement for environmental justice, the recognition that black and brown communities bear the brunt of pollution, climate change, and environmental racism. It is happening in the struggle for healthcare equity, the acknowledgement that black people face higher rates of maternal mortality, chronic illness, and medical neglect. It is happening in the push for economic justice, the fight for living wages, affordable housing, and an end to the wealth gap created by slavery, segregation, and discrimination. It is happening in the demand for political power, the effort to elect leaders who represent black communities and to hold those leaders accountable. And it is happening in the simple, profound act of survival. Every day, black people navigate a world that was not designed for their flourishing. They build families, create art, start businesses, pursue education, and find joy, not in spite of oppression, but in defiance of it. That, too, is resistance. That, too, is history. The challenges are immense. Systemic racism persists in every institution. White supremacy adapts, finding new forms and new language. The progress that has been won is fragile, constantly under threat of reversal. But the struggle continues. Because it must. Because black people have never waited for permission to be free. They have taken freedom, piece by piece, generation by generation, through sacrifice and strategy, through pain and persistence. And they will continue. Conclusion: the invitation. Black history is not a story with a neat ending. It is not a problem that has been solved. It is a living, breathing, evolving force, shaped by those who came before and those who are here now. To engage with black history is to confront uncomfortable truths about power, violence, and injustice. It is to recognize that the wealth and stability many enjoy were built on the suffering of others. It is to understand that freedom is not a gift, it is a demand, a struggle, and a responsibility. But it is also to witness extraordinary resilience, creativity, and courage. It is to see how people, stripped of everything, created culture from nothing. It is to learn how movements, born in oppression, transformed nations. It is to be inspired by the refusal to accept dehumanization. This history belongs to everyone. Not because everyone has experienced it, but because everyone has been shaped by it. The systems that were built to exploit black people have also shaped labor, law, politics, and culture for all people. The movements that black people led have expanded rights and freedoms that benefit everyone. The art that black people created has enriched the world. To ignore this history is to misunderstand the present. To erase this history is to repeat its worst chapters. But to engage with it, to listen, to learn, to reckon, is to participate in the ongoing work of justice. So we invite you to be part of that conversation. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something new, share your thoughts in the comments. If this history matters to you, like and share this documentary so these stories continue to reach others. And if you believe that black history deserves space, honesty, and depth, subscribe for more stories that explore the past, confront the present, and shape the future. Because history lives when we engage with it. And this story continues, with you. Before the classrooms, before the textbooks, before the institutions and the recognition, there was a question that haunted a young man born into a world still scarred by slavery. The question was simple, yet profound: where are we in the story? Not as footnotes. Not as problems to be solved. Not as laborers whose hands built a nation but whose names were left unrecorded. Where are we as thinkers, leaders, innovators, and architects of civilization? This question, dangerous in its implications, transformative in its pursuit, would consume the life of Carter Godwin Woodson. It would drive him to challenge the most powerful institutions of his time. It would lead him to create what did not exist, to document what had been erased, and to insist that history was not merely a record of the past, but a weapon that could either imprison or liberate. To understand Carter G. Woodson is to understand the world he entered, a world designed to forget. The year was 1875. The Civil War had ended a decade earlier. Slavery, the institution that had defined American life for centuries, had been legally abolished. But freedom, as millions of formerly enslaved people would discover, was not the same as justice. It was not the same as opportunity. And it was certainly not the same as remembrance. Woodson was born in New Canton, Virginia, to parents who had known bondage firsthand. James and Eliza Woodson had spent their lives as property, denied education, denied autonomy, denied even the right to their own names in legal documents. When freedom came, it arrived without land, without resources, without reparations. It arrived with a single expectation: survive. And so the Woodson family, like millions of others, worked the land. They labored in fields and mines, in conditions that differed from slavery more in name than in substance. Poverty was not an abstraction, it was the rhythm of daily life. Childhood, for Carter and his siblings, was not a time of play and innocence. It was a time of work. Carter worked in the coal mines of West Virginia, descending into darkness before dawn, emerging after dusk. These were places where time lost meaning, where the body became a tool, and where the future seemed as narrow as the tunnels themselves. School was irregular, often impossible. In the rural South, education for black children was not a right, it was a privilege that depended on the season, on the availability of teachers, on the tolerance of white communities who questioned whether black people needed to read at all. And yet, something stirred in the young Carter Woodson. It was not ambition in the conventional sense. It was not a desire for wealth or status. It was something deeper, more fundamental, a hunger to understand. Why were there no books about people like him? Why did history, as it was taught in the few classrooms he managed to attend, seem to begin and end with other people's triumphs? Why did Black existence appear in textbooks only as a problem, never as a contribution? These questions had no easy answers. In fact, they were questions that most people around him had learned not to ask. The system had been designed to discourage curiosity, to make erasure feel natural, to transform absence into inevitability. But Woodson could not accept it. He pursued education with an intensity that startled those who knew him. When he finally entered high school, late, older than his peers, he completed the curriculum in just 2 years. This was not genius for show. It was necessity. Time had already been stolen. He intended to reclaim it. From there, his trajectory seemed almost impossible for someone of his background. He attended Berea College in Kentucky, one of the few institutions in the South that admitted both black and white students, though they were taught separately. He went on to the University of Chicago, where he earned advanced degrees. And in 1912, he achieved what seemed unthinkable. He became the second Black American to earn a PhD from Harvard University, following in the footsteps of W.E.B. Du Bois. By every conventional measure, Carter G. Woodson had succeeded. But success, for Woodson, brought not satisfaction, it brought clarity. Inside the hallowed halls of Harvard, surrounded by the finest scholars in the nation, Woodson encountered something that would change the course of his life. He encountered the architecture of erasure. History, as it was taught at Harvard and other elite institutions, was presented with absolute confidence. It was framed as objective, universal, complete. Professors lectured with authority. Textbooks were written with certainty. The narrative of human civilization was laid out as if it were fact, as if it were the only story that mattered. But Woodson, trained now to read critically, saw what others missed. He saw the omissions. He saw how Africa was portrayed, not as a continent of empires, trade networks, universities, and innovation, but as a blank space waiting for European contact. The achievements of ancient African civilizations, Egypt, Kush, Aksum, Mali, Songhai, were either ignored or attributed to outside influences. The assumption was clear: black people had contributed nothing to human progress. He saw how black Americans were depicted in the few instances they appeared in textbooks at all. They were laborers. They were slaves. They were problems to be managed, never leaders to be celebrated. Their resistance, their innovation, their intellectual contributions, all of it was erased or minimized. And perhaps most damaging of all, Woodson saw how this version of history was taught to black children. They sat in classrooms, absorbing lessons that told them they came from nothing. They memorized the achievements of others while their own ancestors remained unnamed. They learned to admire civilizations that had enslaved them, while the civilizations their ancestors had built were dismissed as primitive or non-existent. This was not education. This was indoctrination. Woodson would later give it a name: miseducation. Miseducation was not simply the absence of information. It was the presence of distortion. It was a system that actively taught black people to doubt themselves, to see themselves as inferior, to internalize the very racism that oppressed them. And it was devastatingly effective. A child taught that their people have no history will struggle to imagine a future. A student trained to admire only the achievements of others will measure themselves against standards designed to exclude them. A community disconnected from its past will find it difficult to assert its worth in the present. Woodson understood that history was not neutral. It was power. The power to define who mattered. The power to determine what was remembered. The power to shape how future generations understood themselves. And that power, in early 20th century America, was wielded almost exclusively by white men. This realization transformed Woodson. Where others might have sought acceptance within the existing academic system, Woodson began to question its foundations. Where others might have tried to reform institutions from within, Woodson recognized that reform was not enough. What was needed was something entirely new. He did not ask for permission. He did not wait for approval. He acted. In 1915, Woodson founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, known as ASAL. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a declaration of independence. Woodson had looked for institutions dedicated to the scholarly study of black history and found none. Universities were indifferent. Funding was non-existent. White-controlled academic organizations had no interest in prioritizing narratives that challenged the dominant story of American progress. If the work was to be done, Woodson realized, he would have to do it himself. ASAL was designed to be both rigorous and revolutionary. It would gather scholars, teachers, and students committed to documenting Black life across centuries and continents. It would collect evidence, preserve records, and publish research. It would assert, through careful scholarship, that Black history was real, complex, and worthy of study. The following year, in 1916, Woodson launched the Journal of Negro History. This was not a newsletter. It was not a pamphlet. It was a peer-reviewed academic journal that demanded the highest standards of scholarship. Every article had to be documented, sourced, and credible. Woodson insisted on rigor precisely because he knew that Black scholarship would be scrutinized more harshly than any other. The journal had to be beyond reproach. Through its pages, Woodson gave voice to historians who had been ignored. He published research on Black inventors, educators, soldiers, artists, and leaders. He documented the achievements of African civilizations. He traced the contributions of Black Americans to every aspect of national life, from agriculture to architecture, from science to literature. Every article was a reclamation. Every footnote was a correction. Every issue was a refutation of the lie that Black people had contributed nothing. But Woodson understood that scholarship alone was not enough. Journals reached academics. They influenced other scholars. But they did not reach the children sitting in segregated classrooms across the South, being taught that their history began with slavery and ended with subjugation. Woodson needed something more. Something that could penetrate the educational system itself. Something that could force schools to acknowledge what they had spent decades erasing. And so, in 1926, Woodson introduced Negro History Week. The timing was deliberate. He placed it in February, aligning it with the birthdays of two figures already honored in Black communities: Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved man who became one of the nation's most powerful voices for abolition, and Abraham Lincoln, the president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. By connecting his initiative to existing traditions, Woodson ensured that it would resonate. But he also ensured that it would challenge. Negro History Week was not a celebration in the superficial sense. It was a correction. It was a demand that schools acknowledge what they had ignored. Teachers were encouraged to dedicate 1 week each year to teaching Black history. Students were asked to learn about figures and events that had been left out of their textbooks. Communities organized lectures, performances, and discussions. It was a small intervention, but it was strategic. Woodson never intended for Black history to be confined to a single week. The week was a beginning, a foothold, a way to assert the presence of Black history within a system that had long denied it. He envisioned a future where Black history would be integrated into every classroom, every textbook, every conversation about the past. Negro History Week was the spark. The hope was that it would ignite a larger fire. And it did. Slowly, gradually, Negro History Week gained traction. Teachers embraced it. Communities celebrated it. Black students, for the first time, saw themselves reflected in the curriculum. They learned about Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, about Benjamin Banneker and Garrett Morgan, about the Tuskegee Airmen and the Buffalo Soldiers. They learned that their history did not begin with slavery. That their ancestors had built empires, created art, developed systems of governance, and resisted oppression with courage and intelligence. They learned that they came from something. This was revolutionary. Because a people who know their history cannot be told they are worthless. A people who understand their past cannot be convinced they have no future. Woodson understood this. He understood that the battle over history was not about the past, it was about the present and the future. It was about identity, dignity, and power. But the work came at a cost. Woodson lived modestly, almost ascetically. He never married. He poured his earnings back into his work, funding publications, research, and educational programs. He lived in small apartments, owned few possessions, and avoided the trappings of success that others might have pursued. This was not deprivation for its own sake. It was focus. Woodson knew that his mission required everything he had. There was no room for distraction, no space for compromise. He also faced resistance, constant, relentless resistance. White academics dismissed his work as biased. They questioned the credibility of black scholarship, even when it met the highest standards of evidence and rigor. They refused to engage with the research published in the Journal of Negro History, preferring to maintain the fiction that black people had contributed nothing to civilization. But Woodson also faced resistance from within the black community. Some black elites saw his work as unnecessary or even dangerous. They worried that emphasizing black history would alienate white allies, that it would reinforce segregation rather than promote integration. They believed that the path to progress lay in assimilation, in proving to white America that black people could adopt their culture, their values, their way of seeing the world. Woodson rejected this view entirely. He argued that assimilation without self-knowledge was a form of surrender. That integration without dignity was hollow. That black people could not achieve true equality if they did not first understand their own worth. He was not interested in gaining acceptance from institutions that had spent centuries erasing black contributions. He was interested in building something new, something that could stand on its own, something that could endure. And so he pressed forward, often alone, often misunderstood, but always certain of his purpose. Woodson's philosophy was rooted in a simple but radical belief: education should liberate, not oppress. For too long, education had been used as a tool of control. Black children were taught to see themselves as inferior. They were trained to admire the achievements of others while doubting their own capacity for greatness. They absorbed lessons that reinforced the social hierarchy, that justified segregation, that naturalized inequality. Woodson called this miseducation, and he saw it as one of the most insidious forms of oppression. Because physical chains could be broken. Laws could be changed. But mental chains, the internalized belief that you are less than, that your people have contributed nothing, that your history is shameful, those chains were harder to break. Miseducation created those chains. And only education, true education, grounded in truth and evidence, could shatter them. Woodson's most famous work, The Miseducation of the Negro, published in 1933, laid out this argument in devastating detail. He examined how the educational system had been designed to produce compliant workers rather than independent thinkers. He showed how black students were taught to admire European civilization while despising their own heritage. He demonstrated how this process created a cycle of dependency, where black people looked to others for validation rather than asserting their own worth. The book was a manifesto, a call to action, and a warning. It argued that without a fundamental transformation of education, black people would remain oppressed, not by laws alone, but by the stories they told themselves. Woodson's vision extended beyond classrooms. He understood that history was taught not only in schools but in public spaces, in monuments, in commemorations, in the stories a society chose to tell about itself. And in early 20th century America, those stories were designed to glorify white achievement while erasing black contributions. Monuments celebrated Confederate generals. Textbooks praised plantation owners. Public memory honored those who had fought to preserve slavery, while those who had resisted it were forgotten. Woodson saw this as a form of cultural violence. It was not enough to change laws or policies. The narrative itself had to be challenged. And so he worked tirelessly to recover the stories that had been lost. He traveled to archives, combed through records, interviewed elders who remembered what textbooks had erased. He documented the lives of black inventors whose patents had been stolen, black soldiers whose service had been ignored, black educators who had built schools with nothing but determination and hope. Every story he recovered was an act of resistance. Every name he preserved was a refutation of the lie that black people had no history worth remembering. Woodson trained a generation of historians to continue this work. He mentored scholars, funded research, and created networks of teachers and students committed to the study of black history. He understood that the work could not rest on his shoulders alone. It had to be a movement, sustained across generations. And it was. The scholars Woodson trained went on to teach others. The institutions he founded continued to publish, to research, to educate. The week he established grew into a month, recognized nationally, celebrated in schools across the country. But Woodson did not live to see the full impact of his work. He died in 1950, quietly, without fanfare. At the time of his death, Black History Month did not yet exist. The civil rights movement had not yet reached its peak. His work was known primarily within academic circles and among those committed to black education. Yet his influence was already spreading, roots growing deep beneath the surface, preparing to break through. Everything that followed, the expansion of Negro History Week into Black History Month in 1976, the establishment of Black Studies departments in universities, the ongoing debates over curriculum and representation, can be traced back to Woodson's vision and labor. He created the foundation. He laid the groundwork. He proved that Black history could be documented, studied, and taught with the same rigor as any other field of inquiry. And he did it without waiting for permission. This is perhaps the most important lesson of Woodson's life. He did not ask institutions to validate his work. He did not seek approval from those who had spent centuries erasing Black contributions. He built what did not exist. He created the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History when no such organization existed. He launched the Journal of Negro History when no academic journal would publish Black scholarship. He established Negro History Week when schools refused to teach Black history. He did not wait for the world to change. He changed it. This required extraordinary courage. It required discipline, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to truth. It required the ability to work in isolation, to face criticism and indifference, to persist when others would have given up. Woodson possessed all of these qualities. He was not interested in fame. He did not seek recognition or accolades. He measured success not by personal achievement but by impact, by the number of students who learned their history, by the number of scholars who continued the work, by the slow but steady shift in how Black people understood themselves. And that shift, though gradual, was profound. Before Woodson, many Black Americans had internalized the narrative of inferiority. They believed, because they had been taught, that their ancestors had contributed little to civilization. They accepted, because it was repeated endlessly, that their history began with slavery. Woodson shattered that narrative. He showed that African civilizations had thrived for millennia before European contact. He documented the intellectual, artistic, and technological achievements of Black people across the diaspora. He proved that Black Americans had been essential to every stage of the nation's development, from the fields to the factories, from the battlefields to the laboratories. He gave Black people a past they could be proud of. And in doing so, he gave them a future they could believe in. This is why Woodson is called the father of Black history. Not because he was the first to study it, others had come before. Not because he was the only one doing the work, he trained and supported many others. But because he institutionalized it. He made it sustainable. He ensured that it would endure. Without Woodson, Black history might have remained a marginal pursuit, studied by a few dedicated scholars but ignored by the broader society. Without his institutions, his journals, his week of recognition, the work might have died with him. But it didn't. It grew. It spread. It became a movement. Today, Black History Month is recognized across the United States. Black Studies programs exist in universities nationwide. Textbooks, though still imperfect, include far more about Black contributions than they did in Woodson's time. Public memory has begun, however slowly, to acknowledge what was long erased. None of this would have happened without Carter G. Woodson. And yet, his work remains unfinished. The debates Woodson engaged in, over whose history gets taught, how it is framed, what is emphasized and what is omitted, continue today. Battles over curriculum rage in school boards across the country. Efforts to ban books, to restrict discussions of race and history, to erase uncomfortable truths, echo the same forces Woodson fought against a century ago. His warnings about miseducation remain relevant. His insistence that history is power, that knowledge is liberation, that a people disconnected from their past cannot build a meaningful future, all of this resonates as strongly today as it did in his lifetime. Woodson understood something fundamental: the fight over history is never really about the past. It is about the present and the future. It is about who gets to define reality, who gets to claim authority, who gets to shape the stories that a society tells about itself. And those stories matter. They shape how children see themselves. They influence what people believe is possible. They determine who is honored and who is forgotten, who is centered and who is marginalized. Woodson spent his life fighting to ensure that Black people would be part of that story, not as footnotes or problems, but as full participants, as contributors, as human beings with agency, intelligence, and dignity. He did not do this work for recognition. He did it because it needed to be done. Because the alternative, the continued erasure of a people's history, was intolerable. And he did it with a discipline and rigor that commands respect even from those who might have disagreed with his conclusions. He did not rely on sentiment or emotion. He relied on evidence. He documented everything. He insisted on the highest standards of scholarship, knowing that anything less would be dismissed. This combination of moral urgency and intellectual rigor is what made Woodson's work so powerful. He was not just an activist. He was not just a scholar. He was both, seamlessly integrating the two in a way that few have managed before or since. His life offers a model for how to pursue justice through knowledge, how to challenge power through truth, how to build institutions that can outlast any individual. Woodson's legacy is not just the institutions he founded or the books he wrote. It is the idea that history belongs to everyone, that knowledge should serve the people, and that education can be a tool of liberation rather than oppression. This idea has inspired generations of scholars, teachers, and activists. It has shaped movements for educational justice, for curriculum reform, for the recognition of marginalized voices in history. And it continues to inspire today. Every teacher who includes Black history in their curriculum, every scholar who researches neglected topics, every student who learns about figures like Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass or Carter G. Woodson himself, they are all part of the legacy he created. Woodson proved that one person, armed with knowledge and determination, can change the world. Not through violence. Not through spectacle. But through the patient, persistent work of recovering truth and sharing it with others. He showed that history is not fixed, that it can be reclaimed, that what has been erased can be remembered. And he showed that this work is essential, not just for Black people, but for everyone. Because a society that erases part of its history is a society that cannot fully understand itself. A nation that ignores the contributions of some of its people is a nation that diminishes everyone. Woodson's vision was not narrow. It was expansive. He believed that understanding Black history would enrich everyone's understanding of the past. That acknowledging Black contributions would strengthen, not weaken, the national narrative. He was right. The fuller, more honest account of history that Woodson fought for is not just more accurate, it is more interesting, more complex, more human. It reveals connections and contributions that had been hidden. It shows resistance where there was supposed to be only submission. It demonstrates ingenuity where there was supposed to be only dependence. This is the history Woodson recovered. This is the legacy he left. And it is a legacy that continues to unfold, as new generations take up the work he began, as new scholars recover new stories, as new teachers bring those stories into new classrooms. Carter G. Woodson did not live to see Black History Month. He did not witness the civil rights movement. He did not see the election of a Black president or the establishment of Black studies departments in major universities. But he made all of it possible. He laid the foundation. He created the tools. He trained the scholars. He built the institutions. And most importantly, he changed the conversation. Before Woodson, Black history was seen as marginal, unimportant, not worth studying. After Woodson, it became impossible to ignore. It became a field of serious scholarship, a subject worthy of study, a part of the national story that could no longer be erased. This transformation did not happen overnight. It took decades. It required the work of countless others who built on what Woodson started. But it began with him. With his vision. His courage. His refusal to accept that a people could be written out of history. Carter G. Woodson was born into a world designed to forget. And he spent his life ensuring that the world would remember. He did not do it for glory. He did it because it was necessary. Because the truth mattered. Because a people without a past cannot build a future. And in doing so, he gave millions of people something invaluable, the knowledge of where they came from, the pride in what their ancestors achieved, and the confidence to imagine what they themselves might accomplish. This is the gift Carter G. Woodson gave. This is why he is remembered. This is why his work endures. Not because he was perfect. Not because he had all the answers. But because he asked the right questions, pursued them with discipline and integrity, and refused to stop until he had created something that could outlast him. He was the father of Black history not because he claimed the title, but because he earned it, through decades of work, through sacrifice, through an unwavering commitment to truth and justice. And his legacy lives on, in every classroom where Black history is taught, in every scholar who studies neglected topics, in every student who learns that their history is rich, complex, and worthy of study. Carter G. Woodson changed the world. and the world is better for it.